So the topic for today, we're going to be talking about kind of balancing conformity and personal expression. And in order to get to this, we're actually going to take what might seem like a surprising or surprisingly irrelevant topic, which is that of prophecy and specifically false prophecy. I imagine there aren't too many people on this call who take themselves to be prophets. So what we're going to talk about may seem a little less relevant, but stay with me because as we get towards the end, I think we're going to see some profound lessons that really have some broad relevance to them. We're going to jump into the kind of the crux of this is going to be a piece of the Talmud in Sanhedrin, which discusses some events in First Kings. But in order to get to this, we just need a little bit of background. So the first page here really is just background information. So if we look in Deuteronomy, we see a couple of texts there that discuss the notion of a false prophet. So obviously in the world of prophecy, where prophets exist, there obviously then would be a big question of who's considered a genuine prophet and who's a false prophet. If we're looking to these people who are speaking in the name of God to give us direction, we want to be able to discern between the two. So our first source on the page, Devarim, Deuteronomy 18:20, we read, "But the prophet that shall speak a word presumptuously in my name," meaning improperly, "which I have not commanded him to speak, or that shall speak in the name of other gods, that same prophet shall die." So we see here first a harsh punishment, which makes sense. You're going to be leading the people far astray. But we also have two different types of false prophecy here. Rashi, the famous medieval commentator, helps us sort of concisely explain what those are. So there one is the one who I have not commanded to speak. Rashi explains, but which I may have commanded his fellow prophet to speak. So in this case, the words that might themselves might very well be true because God spoke them to another prophet. But the problem here is that someone who didn't hear these words from God is now speaking them in God's name, and so passing themselves off as a genuine prophet. The problem here is the messenger, not the message itself, but still a problem. And the second, Rashi says, or that shall speak in the name of other gods, even though he be in exact agreement with the halakha, with the Jewish law, that he forbids what is forbidden or permits what is permitted, this is still a problem because they're speaking in the name of other gods. So in this case, right, again, the message itself is presumably true, and yet it's being spoken in the name of another god, so that is also a problem. Now, we have some other questions that we might want to ask about some heuristics for how we're supposed to determine who's a genuine prophet and who's not. And the next two verses address just that, from Deuteronomy 18, where we read, "And you shall ask yourselves, how can we know that the oracle that the prophet spoke was not spoken by the Lord? If the prophet speaks in the name of the Lord and the oracle does not come true, that oracle is not spoken by the Lord. The prophet has uttered it presumptuously. Do not stand in fear of him." Okay, so we have probably in a way that many of us conceptualize prophecy, that there is a prediction that is being offered by the prophet. And here we see a pretty straightforward test. If the prediction comes true, if the prediction does not come true, then we'll say that the prophet is in fact a false prophet. But of course, there are lots of times where someone could make a prediction and it could come true, and it has nothing to do with their direct access to the divine word. So we're still left with a problem of there may be false prophets who can kind of slip through the cracks here because they say something that in fact eventually comes true. And another way that we want to assess a prophet, therefore, is conveyed to us a little bit earlier in Deuteronomy in chapter 13. And there we read the following: "If there arise in the midst of thee a prophet or a dreamer of dreams, and he give thee a sign or a wonder, and the sign or the wonder comes to pass, whereof he spoke unto thee, saying," so right now we're seeing that this prophet, what they've predicted is coming true. So they seem to have passed the test. But nevertheless, that's not the only test that we're going to offer. And this prophet, in fact, says, "Let us go after other gods, which thou hast not known, and let us serve them. In that case, thou shalt not hearken unto the words of that prophet, or unto the dreamer of dreams, for the Lord your God puts you to prove me. He's testing you to know whether you do love your God with all your heart and with all your soul." So in this case, now we're seeing this other element here, which is if this prophet is leading you astray, is contradicting a fundamental tenet of the Torah, which is that you shall follow God and you shall worship God and not other gods. In that case, even if they can do all these signs and wonders that come true, they are still not a genuine prophet. And then we have a more theological explanation. Why then does God allow for this to come true? Because God's actually testing us. Maimonides takes this a bit, he expands the reach of this. It's not just if the prophet is telling you to worship another god, but Maimonides goes further and says, therefore, if a prophet performs great signs and wonders and attempts to deny the prophecy of Moses, we don't listen to him, and we know for certain that the wonders he performed were simply tricks and sorcery. So here, according to Maimonides, if a person comes along, claims to be a prophet, is able to perform seemingly miraculous signs and wonders, which should prove the veracity of their prophetic abilities, nevertheless, if they contradict something that Moshe had said that comes from the Torah, that itself is a sign that they are, in fact, a false prophet. All of this is background. Interesting stuff here for some, maybe others don't find this so compelling. Don't worry, this is really just background for a much broader conceptual point that we're going to get to. And that comes about in the context of, or found in Tractate Sanhedrin, the Babylonian Talmud Sanhedrin. And there, a Mishnah, which is a code of Jewish law from the 2nd century, the Mishnah is talking about false prophets and says that there's a few different kinds of false prophets. One of them is one who prophesies what one has not heard, or what was not told to him is executed by human hands. And the Talmud then asks, what's a paradigmatic case of a prophet who prophesies something that they haven't heard? The Talmud says, he who prophesies what he has not heard, for example, Tzidkiah, the son of Kenana. And that's going to be the focus of what we're going to be talking about today. Who is this person, Tzidkiah ben Kenana? And why is he the paradigmatic case of a prophet who prophesies something they have not heard? And as we explore his personality and a particular event in his life, we will unpack, I think, an idea which has much broader implications. So first, some background, because we're going to read through most of the 22nd chapter of Kings 1 of Melachim Aleph, but we need a little background of what happened in the previous chapter, in chapter 21, which you can certainly take a look at on your own after class. So the broader context is the Jewish people at that time, the full kingdom of Israel is divided into two separate kingdoms. We have the kingdom of what's called Israel in the north and the kingdom of Yehudah, of Judah, in the south. Israel is ruled by a king, Achav, who is a fairly bad guy. And he's married also to a woman, Jezebel, who's also a pretty wicked woman herself. And I'll explain the story in a moment, but just one anecdote. A number of years ago, there was a restaurant in New York City that was called Jezebel, and they wanted to be certified kosher by the OU, by the Orthodox Union. And the Orthodox Union didn't want to be associated with a place that had the name of a wicked character from Tanakh, so refused to certify them unless they changed the name of the restaurant, which I think they eventually did. But in chapter 21 of Kings, we read that the king Achav wants to expand his territory, which includes the vineyard of a man named Navot. And Navot refuses to allow to kind of sell his property to the king. And the king himself kind of doesn't do very much, but his wife, Jezebel, does. So she steps in and she wants to remove Navot from the equation. And the way that she does that is she essentially hires two witnesses to bear false testimony against Navot, so that he ends up being executed. And that is the background for this 22nd chapter in Kings 1, which is where we're going to encounter this man, Tzidkiah ben Kenana. So we read here that there was a lull of 3 years with no war between Aram, who's a neighboring country of Israel, and the northern kingdom of Israel. In the third year, King Yehoshaphat of Judah, so again, remember, countries divide into two: northern kingdom of Israel, ruled by Achav, southern kingdom of Yehuda, of Judah, ruled by Yehoshaphat. He came to visit the king of Israel. The king of Israel said to his courtiers, "You know that remote Gilad, a place in Aram, belongs to us, and yet we do nothing to recover it from the hands of the king of Aram." And he said to Yehoshaphat, the king of Judah, "Will you come with me, form an alliance to battle at remote Gilad?" Yehoshaphat answered the king of Israel, "I will do what you do. My troops shall be your troops. My horses shall be your horses," meaning our militaries will align ourselves. I will assist you in this battle, but with one caveat. Verse 5 here. But Yehoshaphat said further to the king of Israel, "Please first inquire of the Lord." So it was proper protocol for kings for Jewish kings to consult with God specifically around certain kinds of wars. So the king of Israel gathered the prophets, about 400 men. So you may not have known this, but there were lots of prophets that were around at the time. There were even prophecy schools. And he gathers 400 prophets, and he asks them, "Shall I march upon remote Gilad for battle, or shall I not?" "March," they said, "and the Lord will deliver the territory, into your majesty's hands." Okay, this seems so far so good. Then Yehoshaphat asked, "Isn't there another prophet of the Lord here through whom we can inquire?" For some reason, he is a little bit suspicious of these 400 prophets, and he asks, "Are there any remaining ones that we still may want to consult?" And the king of Israel answered Yehoshaphat, "There is one more man through whom we can inquire of the Lord, but I hate him because he never prophesies anything good for me, but only misfortune. And his name is Michaihu, son of Imlah." So already, right, we're seeing kind of get the impression of a kind of Putin-esque ruler here who only wants obsequious yes men to inform him. And so he doesn't like this prophet because this prophet often says things that are not favorable to him. And his name is Michaiah. But King Yehoshaphat said, "Don't say that, your majesty," meaning don't just dismiss him. I still want to know what he says. So the king of Israel summoned an officer and said, "Bring Michaiah, son of Imlah, at once." The king of Israel and King Yehoshaphat of Judah were seated on their thrones, arrayed in their robes, on the threshing floor at the entrance of the gate of Samaria, and all the prophets were prophesying before them. And now, enter scene, we have our protagonist, Tzidkiah, the son of Canaan. Tzidkiah, son of Canaan, had provided himself with iron horns. He's one of these 400 prophets. And he said, "Thus said the Lord, with these you shall gore the Arameans till you make an end of them." He takes the previous prophecy and now he embellishes this with a kind of full theatrical performance. And all the other prophets were prophesying similarly and still saying, "March upon remote Gilad and triumph. The Lord will deliver it into your majesty's hands." The messenger who had gone to summon Michaiah said to him, "Look, the words of the prophets are with one accord favorable to the king. Let your word be like that of the rest of them. Speak a favorable word." And Michaiah now answers, "As the Lord lives," Michaiah answered, "I will speak only what the Lord tells me." When he came before the king said to him, "Michaiah, shall we march upon remote Gilad for battle, or shall we not?" He answered him, "March and triumph, just like all the other prophets. The Lord will deliver it into your majesty's hands." Now, even though the king here wants a certain answer, for some reason he's suspicious of Michaiah, and he both wants to hear what he wants to hear, but he also wants it to be a genuine prophecy. So he pushes him a little further. The king said to him, "How many times must I adjure you to tell me nothing but the truth in the name of the Lord?" Then he, meaning Michaiah, said, "I saw all Israel scattered over the hills, like sheep without a shepherd, And the Lord said, these have no master. Let everyone return to his home in safety. Right, so he's now prophesying that the king will no longer be around, that he will be killed. And now the king himself here, Achav, gets angry and he says, didn't I tell you, said the king of Israel to Yehoshaphat, that he would not prophesy good fortune for me, but only misfortune? But Michaiah now persists, I call upon you to hear the word of the Lord. I saw the Lord seated upon his throne, with all the host of heaven standing in attendance to the right and to the left of him. And the Lord asked, who will entice Achav so that he will march and fall at Ramoth Gilead? Then one said thus, and another said thus, until a certain spirit came forward and stood before the Lord and said, I will entice him. How? The Lord asked him. And he replied, I will go out, and I will be a lying spirit in the mouth of all his prophets. Then he said, meaning the Lord said, you will entice and you will prevail. Go out and do it. Right, so what's happening here now is Michaiah is both offering a genuine prophecy that the king, that Achav will die in battle, and he's also now explaining why these other 400 prophets are all getting it wrong. Because in sort of this esoteric realm of God, God appointed some spirit to go and be a lying spirit in the, I guess, the minds, of the hearts, the mouths of all of these prophets. And so they're actually offering false prophecy because they've been deceived. Then he said, in verse 23, so the Lord has put a lying spirit in the mouth of all these prophets of yours. For the Lord has decreed disaster upon you. Thereupon Sidkiah, the son of Kenana, stepped up and struck Michaiah on the cheek and demanded, which way did the Spirit of the Lord pass for me to speak with you? So Sidkiah ben Kenana, the Talmud understands to be this paradigm of the false prophet. And who do we see him to be? He is one of 400 prophets who offers false prophecy. He also embellishes that prophecy with these horns that he dramatically presents to the king. And then finally, he also tries to suppress and shut down Michaiah, who is arguing that Sidkiah and everyone else's prophecy is false. Nevertheless, it's still not entirely clear why he is the paradigm of a false prophet, and the Talmud is uncertain about this also. So if we turn here to page 3, where we get to the next part of the piece of Talmud where we had paused to give ourselves the background from what we just read in Kings 1, the Talmud now says, he who prophesies what he has not heard, Sidkiah the son of Kenana. As it is written, and Sidkiah the son of Kenana had made him horns of iron, as we saw. And now the Talmud asks what I think is a very good question. But what else could he have done, seeing that the spirit of Navot had deceived him? So just to understand, right, we saw in the Tanakh, the biblical text itself, that Michaiah had this vision of God and God's kind of entourage, whatever exactly that means, and a spirit agreeing or volunteering to go forth and be a lying voice in the minds of all of these prophets. And the Talmud here is interpreting that spirit, who's anonymous in the biblical text, to be Navot. Navot, who in chapter 21 was set up, framed by the wife of the king of Achav. And so Navot here is now getting his revenge. And so the Talmud here now quotes this directly, as is written, and the Lord said, who shall persuade Achav that he may go up and fall at Ramoth Gilead? And there came forth a spirit and stood before the Lord and said, I will persuade him. And he said, thou shalt persuade him and prevail also, go forth and do so. So the question that the Talmud here is asking, which I think is a very good one, is we see already in the biblical text that God, sort of through a spirit, enters into the minds or hearts of these prophets, including Sidkiah, and reveals to them a prophecy which is false. And that seems to be strange then, that we are saying that Tzidkiah is an example, or perhaps the paradigmatic example, of a prophet who's prophesying something they haven't heard, because Tzidkiah has heard a prophecy. It happens to be that God is deceiving him, but it's not as if he's someone who's just concocting this prophecy entirely on his own. So it seems very strange, as the Talmud's asking here, what exactly was Tzidkiah supposed to do? He's a prophet, trained in prophecy, whatever exactly that means. He goes through the normal procedures as a prophet's supposed to do. He receives a message, and he now voices that message. So why is he a prophet who has done something wrong, who's prophesying a false prophecy? It's not from his own volition. And now the Talmud says something very intriguing. And this line here is really the core of today's lesson. He, Tzidkiah, should have scrutinized the words, the forecasts of all the other 399 prophets, in accord with Rabbi Yitzchak, Rabbi Isaac, who said, the same communication is revealed to many prophets, yet no two prophets prophesy in identical phraseology. So what exactly is going on here? In the text in 1 Kings, all of the 400 prophets say the exact same thing. And according to this understanding of prophecy from Rabbi Yitzchak, prophets never say the exact same thing. They're always given a kind of message that is, they hear or see, or whatever exactly the nature of prophecy is. They see the same thing, but they always prophesy in different words. Meaning, what was Tzidkiah supposed to have done? When he opened his mouth and shared his prophecy, and then he looked around and heard that all of the other prophets were saying the exact same thing, that should have been an alarm bell. We saw kind of at the beginning of our text various ways that we might test to see if a prophet is false. But here we're seeing another one, which is if multiple prophets are saying the exact same thing, that itself is evidence that their prophecies are false. And that actually is a way, apparently, that a prophet can even test their own prophecy to see if it itself is actually correct. And so Tzidkiah, once he heard that everyone was prophesying the same thing, he should have backed down and said, something's wrong here. Instead, he doubles down, right? He reveals these iron horns. He again prophesies the same message, but this time even more dramatic fashion. And then when Michayu comes along and challenges this group, this entourage of prophets, Tzidkiah then tries to suppress him. So he becomes a bad actor. He becomes a problematic character, not because of his initial prophecy, but because he didn't then pay attention to everyone prophesying in the exact same words. And the Talmud here then offers an example of two prophets who must have received the same general prophecy, the same message, but they offer those messages in their own words. Ovadia and Yirmiyahu. Ovadia said, the pride of thine heart has deceived thee, while Yirmiyahu said, thy terribleness has deceived thee, and the pride of thine heart. Meaning, it's the same thing. The general content of what they're saying is the same, but their exact phraseology, their words, are different. And the Talmud now concludes, but since all these prophets employed exactly the same expression, it proved that they had nothing really divinely inspired to offer. Now, I think this should be rather surprising, right? If you have multiple prophets, in this case, many prophets, hundreds of them, and they're all prophesying the exact same phrase, you would think that actually is evidence to the truth, right? Multiple people are saying the same thing. It must be true. We tend to think that when there's discordance, that would mean that there's some kind of disagreement perhaps happening. It's less miraculous. In fact, there's a story in the Talmud in Megillah where Ptolemy required the rabbis to translate the Torah, and he divided them up and put them in independent places, and they each came up with the exact same translation, the exact same words, and that is seen as a miracle because how else could people translate a huge text in the exact same way? But in this case, we're seeing that when it comes to prophecy, uniformity itself is actually a sign of the lack of veracity of the prophecy itself, which I think would be rather surprising. So a legal scholar, Suzanne Lastone, who's a professor of law at Cardozo Law School in New York, she's written about this topic, and she says something helps to try and unpack and explain why it is that by having the same uniform voice, that's a problem, but by having individual expression, that actually is evidence for the veracity of the prophecy. And Professor Stone writes, the individual prophet who speaks in his own voice, formulating the message he receives in language compelling to his audience and the needs of the times, has the capacity to inspire ethical and political action and can be trusted to stand up to the reigning powers or the masses. Like the non-conforming Michayu, who calls the king to account before the kingdom of God, the prophet who speaks in his own voice announces that his words are impelled by God alone, and so can be trusted to represent God's will. The smooth words in unison of the 400 are, by contrast, worthless, and that each is the product of a conformist group mentality motivated by the desire to please the king. Right, so in this way, the fact that everyone is sharing the exact same words is suspicious because it's conveying that they have some other end that they are directing themselves to. In this case, trying to say what exactly the king wants them to say. And Stone continues, unique expressions may be a mark of a true prophet. Even Talmudic midrashic sources acknowledge the human contribution to prophecy. The true prophet does not function merely as a mechanism for transmitting God's words. Rather, the prophetic relationship is dialogic. Thus, the prophet's individual expression may be viewed as a sign of genuine divine human encounter. So there are really two pieces that Stone is saying here. One is this notion of if everyone says the same thing, there's a fear of being a conformist, of just trying to say the right thing, to speak not actually truth, but to speak to whoever's in power and to satisfy their needs or their desires. So that's one. So a prophet who speaks in their own individual words is demonstrating their independence, and that independence is important. But the second piece here, which I think in some ways is more profound, is in as much as we may think of prophecy either based on our own theological beliefs or just prophecy as we study in the Torah itself, whether or not we believe it, but just how it's described, we may think that prophecy is really a prophet being an empty vessel for the divine word, that they're kind of someone who's able to channel and access this divine word, this truth, and therefore they're almost not there. They're almost absent from that message. And what Stone here says is that's not really true, that fundamental to prophecy is a divine human encounter. And as a result, if there's no human element to it that helps craft and shape the words that are spoken, then there's something missing there. It becomes a purely divine word, and there's no human element. And that's not the nature of prophecy. So when we see that with the 400 prophets all saying the exact same thing, there's clearly a human element which is missing there, and that itself is a sign of the lack of its truth. Rabbi Abram Joshua Heschel says something similar in his beautiful book on the prophets, which I think was originally his PhD dissertation in Berlin, which he adapted into this book. And it's a long study of the prophets. And he says something similar that's fundamental to understanding when we want to study any of the prophets. We have to understand this fundamental idea. And he says, the prophet's task is to convey a divine view. Yet as a person, he is a point of view. He speaks from the perspective of God but he speaks from the perspective of God as perceived from the perspective of his own situation. We must seek to understand not only the views he expounded, but also the attitudes he embodied, his own position, feeling, response. Not only what he said, but also what he lived, the private, the intimate dimension of the word, the subjective side of the message. This is in Heschel's introduction. And what he's trying to convey is this notion that there's not just kind of one pure divine word which gets spoken. We don't have access to that. And in some ways, it's impossible to encounter the divine free from our own selves. And so every prophet also brings themselves to their prophecy. And if we want to study the prophets and understand their prophecies, we can't just understand the words that they're saying. We have to understand who they were to understand the self that they were bringing in that dialogic, that conversation they're having with God in this kind of human divine relationship, because we have to understand them if we want to understand the human aspect to that prophecy. And he describes this a little bit further about the Torah as a whole. He says the nature of revelation, being an event in the realm of the ineffable, the inexpressible, is something which words cannot spell, which human language will never be able to portray. Our categories are not applicable to that which is both within and beyond the realm of matter and mind. The words in which the prophets attempted to relate their experiences were not photographs, but illustrations, not descriptions, but songs. Like all terms that express the ultimate, it, meaning revelation, points to its meaning rather than fully rendering it. Right. So for Heschel, and this is the starting point of really a lot of his writing, there's this notion of the ineffable. We have a way of encountering God which is beyond what's able to be expressed, and also which is the ultimate kind of truth. And because it can't be expressed, any words we use are ultimately too reductive. And so what our words are meant to do, as he says here, is to point to the meaning rather than to directly render it. Right? Think for a moment about a song or a poem. Right? You wouldn't say that a poem is meant to be a full rendering of something or of an experience, but it's meant to point to what that truth is, what its ultimate meaning is. And that's true of revelation as well. And then he concludes this section here. We must not try to read chapters in the Bible dealing with the event at Sinai as if they were texts in systematic theology. Its intention is to celebrate the mystery, to introduce us to it rather than penetrate or to explain it. As a report about revelation, the Bible is itself a midrash. Right? What he's saying here is that the Torah itself, when it talks about Sinai, it talks about revelation in general, it's never a perfect match on what that revelation was. It's always interpreted. A midrash is a rabbinic interpretation. It's always interpreted, just as the prophets that we saw in this Talmudic text we were analyzing. Also, there's the human element. They may encounter the same kind of truth, but they're always going to express it in something which is a individual and personal. Now, I don't believe any of us are prophets. And each of us here in this call, it's a diverse group, may have our own personal understandings and theological beliefs about what happened at Sinai or what the Torah, more generally speaking, is. So for some of us, this might be a really fascinating idea of how we want to think about revelation. And for others, we may struggle to understand what that even means or believe that in the first place. But I think there's a deeper, profound idea here, which is more broadly applicable, which has to do with the nature of truth more generally, right? As Heschel is saying here, prophecy, revelation is just one way of expressing the ultimate, and I think the ultimate truth. There are other ways that we can express that ultimate truth as well. And there are really significant implications here. So the first thing I want to do, I may have shown something, demonstrated this to you last year in a different context, I forget, but actually comes from my own engineering training. It's not so often that I get to bring my engineering background into my rabbinic work. But one of the things I had to do in my freshman year at Cooper Union was we took a drafting class. We had to do hand drafting. This was excruciating for me. I have incredibly poor fine motor skills, and we had to be extremely exact. And even with various tools, I often had to do things 10, 12 times till I got them right. But one relatively regular project we would have, or assignments we would have to do, is come up with a 3-view drawing of different items. So what exactly is a 3-view drawing? A 3-view drawing would be taking something which is in 3 dimensions and trying to express it or convey that that object in purely 2-dimensional depictions, but using a series of 2-dimensional depictions to express the full 3-dimensional object. So as an example, if you take, say, this glass that I have in my hand, so it's 3 dimensions. So one way which I could try and draw this would be, as you might think, with certain angles and shadows to convey the 3-dimensionality of it. But actually, the easiest way to do this in a concise way with all the information needed, let's say if someone wanted to mimic or machine this part, would be multiple 2-dimensional expressions of this, 2-dimensional projections. So what does that mean? You look at this glass and imagine that it weren't in 3 dimensions, but you're only seeing it in 2 dimensions, essentially the shadow that it casts from this direction, and then from the top. So what would you come up with? You would come up with something like this. Hopefully you can see this. 3 different perspectives. From the top over here, right, you would just see a circle. And I can't really tilt this without spilling my water, but it's a circular opening. And then from the side of the glass, you would also then see what looks like most of a rectangle. Because even though it's rounded, imagine the shadow that would be cast by this, the projection of this into a 2-dimensional plane would just be like an open rectangle like I have here. And in this case, because it's symmetrical, that would also be what we would see from the 3rd perspective as well. So why is this important? Because if we think about the world and truth in all kinds of forms, not just revelation, we can say that ultimate truth is, speaking allegorically, is in 3 dimensions, but our words or our ideas are really only in 2 dimensions. And so in order to fully grasp, to fully understand the fullness of reality, we actually need multiple perspectives in 2 dimensions to convey the full 3-dimensionality, right? So if I were to try and understand this glass, certainly if I think that the ultimate truth is just in 2 dimensions, this circle and this kind of rectangle here are clearly not the same thing, right? But once I understand what's going on, that one is from the perspective of the side, one's from the perspective of the top, looking down, we see that actually these 2 things are just 2 different perspectives of the exact same object. So they're not actually contradictory, they're complementary. And if we ever want to fully understand the truth, the full 3-dimensionality of this glass, we need multiple 2-dimensional depictions. And so too, when it comes to overall truth in the world, if we want to really understand the fullness of reality, we need multiple perspectives because our language, our ideas are, in this allegory, 2-dimensional, whereas reality itself is 3-dimensional. And so I think that some of what's going on here, which is that, at least in Revelation, but again, I think this is more broadly applicable, what the problem with Tzidkiah ben Kenana is that everyone's saying the exact same thing, and they're not bringing their own perspective here. And ultimately, things that are fundamentally really true can't be encapsulated by just one perspective, and they require multiple perspectives, and therefore, if they all say the exact same thing, they're missing something. So I want to take a look at one more text here from Rabbi Abraham Isaac Kook, the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi of then Palestine, because this conveys, I think, a really important idea both within Jewish thinking more generally, not having to do with revelation, and I think which is a kind of lesson, a kind of value which would be really important for us in an academic setting at Harvard and then more generally in the world to adopt for ourselves, because I think it's missing. And he comments on this, this verse that Torah scholars increase peace in the world. And he writes, some people are mistakenly misguided with the notion that world peace will not be built except by establishing one standard of beliefs and traits. If this is the case, when they witness a Torah scholar engaging in intellectual inquiry, and via his study, differing opinions and sides to a matter are seen to increase. If one's ever walked into a traditional house of study, a Beit Midrash, you hear people arguing with each other. You hear different ideas which disagree with each other. And so it seems as if when people are engaged in Torah scholarship, it seems as if opinions are proliferating and that you're not getting to one unity, one unified conclusion. You're actually doing the opposite. You're seeing more and more opinions increase. So when people witness this, Rav Kook says, they believe that this is the cause of factionalism, the very opposite of peace. The truth is not so. For absolute peace can only be obtained in this world through the format of a multiplicity of peace. A multiplicity of peace means that all of the divergent facets of a matter and the understandings which derive out of study will all be illuminated. And it will become clear how all of them have a place, everything in accordance with its value, purpose, and content. When the true wisdom is uncovered with all of its facets, the matters which at first appear extraneous or contradictory will be seen as vital to the whole. It will become apparent that only through a synthesis of all the components, and sort of my understanding here of all of these different perspectives, through a synthesis of all the components, of all the details, of all the categories, and all of the opinions that at first appear different, specifically through them will the just and true light appear, the knowledge of God, his fear and his love, and the light of the true Torah. Therefore, Torah scholars increase peace in the world. Through their exegesis, they evolve and explain new insights and reveal many new facets. Contained in each new understanding is a diversity of viewpoints. Through this multi-faced prism, which encompasses a matter from all of its sides, the Torah scholars increase peace. As it says, all your children are learned of God. It will be recognized that everyone, even people who are opposites in their paths and opinions, are all seekers of God. Within every one of them, there is a contribution that will be brought to light through the knowledge of God and the illumination of truth. If you want, you can take a look at an article about sort of how this plays itself out in dress in a certain way, which I thought was somewhat cute, but I'm not going to read through that with you, and I'll stop sharing my screen here. One second. So I think you have a really profound notion here, which is that we may think that truth, especially in a religious setting, but perhaps more broadly, is achieved when people come to a consensus, come to an agreement. And what Rav Kook is saying, and I think this is really alluded to in the other texts that we saw with Michaihu, right? That's actually false truth. That's false prophecy. If we believe that everything comes to the sort of, we want to funnel our understandings to come to a consensus, we're missing out on the fact that ultimate truth is not graspable by just a single perspective. And so when 400 prophets all say the same thing, which at first glance you might think is great, that indicates the truth of what they're saying. Really, it's not, because it's flattening the three-dimensionality of revelation of truth more generally into one single two-dimensional perspective. And the only way to get at the ultimate truth is to have these multiple two-dimensional perspectives. I think there's a bit of a trend within the academic world today of a little bit too much orthodoxy, where we try and stifle disagreement. And in many ways, that's actually stifling not just growth, but actually limiting what the true reality is out there. And if we want to ever get to that reality, we need to be able to see things from multiple perspectives. And what that also means is, within some level of reason, when we encounter ideas and views that disagree with what we think, we can also recognize that there might be a truth there that we don't recognize, and we may never be able to reconcile it all together. We can't escape our own perspective, but recognizing that in listening to those various perspectives and viewpoints, they're actually the greater appreciation of the ultimate truth that we may come to. And I think that that should be something that we strive for. I'll conclude with sort of one, I think, kind of funny anecdote, which is I wouldn't take this to mean that all perspectives are all true. And you may be familiar with this notion of Shivim Panim LaTorah, that there are 70 perspectives, 70 faces of the Torah. And I once heard Professor Jonathan Sarna, great professor of Brandeis history, I think he was quoting his father, but it may not have been his father. He said that someone was lecturing and offered some perspective, and somebody else raised their hand and disagreed with him, and then trying to kind of say, we can agree to disagree. He said, there are 70 faces to the Torah. And the professor then responded, it's true, there are 70 faces to the Torah, but yours is the 71st, right? That there's still a limit to number of perspectives. Doesn't mean everything is true, right? So if I put a triangle into these things here, it wouldn't actually be an accurate representation of the of this class. And so I hope through this our studying together, which may have begun in a somewhat esoteric place, talking about prophecy, which may be more or less interesting to some of you, but actually this more profound idea that as we seek, whether it's revelation or truth in other ways, we shouldn't be expecting there to be uniformity and conformity, but actually individual expression can many times be a hallmark of truth. And if we're ever in a situation where there seems to be too much conformity, and some might take that to be evidence for the veracity of those ideas, to be skeptical of that being the case. I'm going to pause here. I have a few more minutes to stay on. So if you have a question, you can raise your hand. Not everyone wants to be recorded, so I am going to stop the recording for this part, just so people can feel a little more free to share.